everybody. It's Maynard and Mike and Colin back for another episode of Close Business Tuesday. This one, we have been kind of on the edge of our seat all day, excited to talk to Ryan Panchadsa. Ryan is at Kleiner Perkins, where he's a senior advisor to the chairman, John Doerr. Ryan was also a deputy chief technology officer in the White House during the Obama administration. He is a Cal Berkeley engineer. He's a great friend, and he's also the co-author of Speed and Scale with John Doerr. So let me just say, Ryan, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a thrill to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are really excited. Ryan, get ready, because we can't wait to visit with you. We're just going to do a little warm-up here. Mike Bradley, what's going on in the markets? What would you tell everybody this week?
Yeah, Maynard, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here. What have we been talking about for the last month or so is volatility in crude oil. And, you know, if you look at this first chart we're putting up here, I mean, you can see crude oil was down about 10, 11% last week, but the equities, like we've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 weeks, have been pretty stable. And I think they're kind of seeing through this and seeing through some of the volatility. Now, one of the things that stands out is the clean energy index is up this last week, and that's because crude oil moved down so much. But some of the events that happened last week and some of the events that we're going to be talking about this week is particularly the SPR. Are we going to be able to pull the capacity out of there? How much we're going to pull out of there? And that kind of leads us to this slide right here and some of the key things that people are talking about. There's a lot of skepticism of how much we're going to be able to pull out of the SPR. I think the Biden administration said we're going to be able to pull out 1 million a day for 180 days, which is 180 million barrels. And to put that in perspective, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've never really been able to get over 700,000 barrels a day. And since the last SPR release, no more over 500,000 barrels a day. So count us skeptical. Second thing is, what is the short-term and long-term effects of the release? Well, short-term, we've seen that, right? Crude went down $8, $9, $10. But the back end of the curve actually went up by $3 or $4, which makes sense, because I think what people are saying is the back end shouldn't go down as much because the government is eventually going to be back there buying barrels 6, 9, 12 months down the road. And the third thing is, will the refill happen? I think a lot of people think it will happen, but I count as skeptical. 2 reasons why people are concerned of whether we're going to have to go this low and whether they'll refill. First of all, if we get the SPR down to what they fully expect, that would be 390 million barrels a day. That would be back to 1984 levels. And to kind of put that in perspective, the U.S. demand right now for crude oil is about 20 million barrels a day. At that rate, we would take the SPR down to 20 days of reserves. That's desperately too low, so that's probably not going to happen. Second of all, I think that's probably the wrong way of looking at it. I think the way we need to look at it is, given that the U.S. production has grown so much over the last 10 or 12 years, we really have to look at what is a net import level rather than the other way. And so when you look at it that way, you really get down to 390 million barrels a day. You get to 130 days of reserves, which is still well above where it's been. Typically over the last 20 years, it's been 75 to 80 days of reserve levels. So you could probably go down another 125 million barrels down from that 390 million barrels and still have enough. So that's something we want to think about. So, like I said, we're in a minority camp. We do not think the Biden administration is going to refill the storage, simply because, there's no need to. Which leads us kind of to the next slide. One of the things that we've been seeing here lately is this is natural gas. Natural gas, if you see the blue line up here, this is where gas is today. That's over $6 an M. And this is really more of a seasonality chart, and kind of give you an idea of where gas is now versus seasonally, at this time of year for the last 10 years. And you can see it's way off the charts. Typically, at the end of the refill season, it's around $3 an M or it's $6 an M, just kind of a point of interest. And the last chart, we'll lead in here because we're going to be talking to Ryan a little bit about new energy and old energy. And what you see is a new energy, and I'm taking the from 12/31/2000 to today. You can see the ICLN is down about 20%, solar is down as well. Lithium is down, but really the old energy has really outperformed here. And the other thing, if you think about the SPAC index, is down about 25% over that time. But also, if you look at the D-SPAC index, where a lot of these companies have come through for financing, is down about 60%. So clearly in the last year and a half or so, the old economy has been doing better than the new energy stuff. And it really is getting people to step back and pause and say, okay, where are we? Do we really need to be substantially to the new energy? They're starting to ask about business models. So, we still think that that's going to be an area that is going to be a lot of investment is going to go to. But what has happened here is that, prior to 2020, a lot of money was made in these stocks, and they've come back quite significantly. And so investors are questioning business models, questioning managements, and I think that's a really good thing. So that's kind of where we are right now, and I just want to lay that out for today.
Awesome. Okay, Colin, what's on your mind today, sir?
What's on my mind today is coal and corn. As I looked across all of global markets, those were the two prices that most jumped out at me. And obviously, the Russia-Ukraine situation is affecting both of those markets. You probably already know that the European Union is talking about banning both Russian coal exports and Russian gas exports. And as that probability has been discounted into various markets, futures, currencies, commodities, equities, we're just seeing a lot of volatility. In the corn market, today we had a 10-cent per bushel move to the upside. In the Chicago wheat futures, it was 39 cents to the upside. And those two markets, if you're not too familiar with where prices are essentially $8 and $10 markets. So those are pretty big moves. And when you look at soybeans, which are at $16.30 on the screen, they've been going 30 or 40 cents up and down each day. So just massive volatility. In the coal market, we saw the equity share prices of the major producers in the United States make 52-week highs today, and they came off 52-week lows exactly 1 year ago. And so putting that all together, I think we're getting in real time some speed and scale on how these linkages across commodity markets and the economics of climate and environment and energy are really entangled in ways that are important to measure and to really have a plan. And I think that you see around the planet, everybody really trying to grab their arms around some of these dynamics. And obviously, there's stuff we know and stuff we don't know. And with that, I'll send it back to you, Maynard.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Colin. Thanks, Mike. Those were a lot of good stuff to jump into. Ryan, we're delighted to have you. The book, we've all done our homework. We've all read it. I'll start off by saying everybody should read this book. It's well laid out. It's thoughtful, and I think it also just presents a certain way of thinking about all these issues that it's important for all of us to understand that perspective. So, kudos to you and your team for putting the book together.
Thank you. It was it's about 2.5 years of effort. This book isn't just John Doerr and myself. It really is the 100 different people that we had to reach out to understand what it would take for this transformation. And, this transformation isn't going to happen overnight. And for us, we used this framework called Objectives and Key Results, OKRs. And we challenged ourselves to look at the climate crisis, look at the thing that's causing it, which is emissions, and try to create OKRs that would help us get from 59 billion tons of emissions down to zero. And so that's what the book contains, not just, a handful of stories and the learnings from those experts, but an actual plan itself.
And maybe, I think the book, it has a number of really instructive charts that help people, puts things in buckets. And as you say, use that OKR framework. Maybe if we could just pull up, I thought the first slide that we noticed in the book that got our attention, I think like everybody, is it was a replication of the story is when FDR wanted to win World War II, he literally got out a napkin, and I think on his napkin it was, defend some of the key areas that are under siege, and then it was attack Japan and attack the Germans in France. This was your net zero 2050 napkin. Do you want to just hit some of these key points here for us?
Yeah, of course. We were so inspired by that FDR napkin, right? In a whole conversation around what's the plan to win World War II, him and General Hap Arnold were able to articulate that on a napkin. And so we gave ourselves the same charge. And so on a napkin, you can see the solutions that are going to take us from 59 to 0, as well as the accelerants that we're going to need. We need to do everything from electrifying transportation to decarbonizing the grid, fixing food, and then protecting nature, cleaning up industry, and to take the remaining, we've got to remove carbon. And so we pair those 6 objectives with 4 accelerants. These are the 4 things that we can pull on to make this transition go faster. It's about winning the policy and politics. It's about turning movements into action from everywhere from the ballot box to the boardroom. It's about innovating and as well investing. And so that's the plan.
So maybe, one of the things, this kind of reminds me, Colin and Mike, of the Salk team does a really good job of just showing, this is the carbon we're producing, this is the carbon we're absorbing, this is how much we're over. They put it in a nice framework. You guys did some similar work, so maybe if we could pull up the second slide, you'll see the 59 gigatons that we're over. You guys, showed the buckets, and let me just ask you to jump in and talk a little bit about these buckets, because it's instructive.
Of course. So, you can add up to the 59 by looking at industry, electricity, transportation, and so forth. But to do the drawdown, you have to approach it a little differently, right? And so in our models and our research, these are the gains, the reductions that we can get from doing each of these actions, right? By electrifying transportation, we knock it down that much. The biggest leap comes from decarbonizing the grid. We then, of course, fixing food, a big element there is really eating less beef. It isn't about going vegan and being vegetarian. Really, like, one of the strong messages we try to put forth in the book is there's a very practical way of getting us to net zero. And in this case, for food, it's just eat less beef and lamb, waste a lot less food, and make sure that the stuff that you are throwing away, you compost it instead of sending it to the landfill. On the protecting nature, where those 6 gigatons come from, that's really ending deforestation, cleaning up industry. This is the hard stuff. This is concrete, steel. And then ultimately, no matter which way we cut it, we are still left over with 10 billion tons a year of emissions, right? This is the most aggressive cuts we could think of. And if you look across at the models from the UN and others, there's still that left over. And hence why the last objective is scaling up a new industry around carbon removal, both nature-based methods as well as engineered ones. And so there's an incredible opportunity there for companies, Maynard, on that front. And so that's the drawdown from 59 to 0. And it will take us the orders of the next 30 years. But the real challenge is, can we get halfway there by the end of this decade?
So one thing I mentioned, Ryan, up front, that we really were impressed by the book and enjoyed reading it. But there is also, it's the, if you will, it's the tech community, it's the Kleiner Perkins, a lot of your portfolio companies and senior advisors, it's almost the Kleiner Perkins family, kind of laying out your thoughts about the energy transition, if you will, and it's quite interesting. Would you mind I think everybody knows Kleiner Perkins, big picture, but maybe talk a little bit about the firm and the funds under management and the history. I think people would find that interesting.
Of course. So Kleiner Perkins, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. Kleiner Perkins is a venture capital firm. We're based in Silicon Valley. We were the first investors in Genentech, in Amazon, in Alphabet, Google, and many other companies. And, we have a history of backing bold and disruptive founders. We have a history of really swinging for the fences and trying to make history. And part of that actually is the Clean Tech 1.0 movement. John Doerr and the partners at the firm at the time were pioneers in the space. And a lot of investments in solar, a lot of investments into alternate proteins and different categories back then. This is right around 2006, 2007. As a firm, we deployed about $1 billion of capital into green, clean investing in that wave. And we're incredibly happy to report that today that 1 billion is 3, and a lot of those wins come from incredible American companies, right? You've got that from Sunrun, you have it from Beyond Meat, you have it from Enphase, you have it from Nest. and I think kind of some of the learnings to share here from our point of view is that, it takes a lot more persistence and a lot more grit to see some of these companies through. But not just that, I think these past few years have been really good to the clean tech movement with these examples of incredible public companies, right? That you can actually look at the stock market and see, this is what a public company in clean tech can look like. I think the darling that's out there is really Tesla, and seeing their market cap, how it's as much as the next 6 car companies combined, and really ushering in this huge wave of momentum around mobility. But you asked about Kleiner. For
Hey,
us
Ryan,
today,
I have to. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to tell you there's a part of the book where we probably all feel like crying, which is you have a lot of fun facts in there, but one of them is $1 million invested in 2007 in Tesla would be worth $1 billion today. So I've spent the last 2 days wondering if I could have come up with $1 million in 2007, just to kind of rub it in.
Well, you're rubbing it in because we do share the story about at Kleiner. We passed on Tesla and invested in Fisker, and it's a fun story that's retold in the book. But you've got to think at the time there's an old saying in venture capital: never invest in anything that has wheels. And the Fisker team really was the one that the Kleiner folks bet on. And as you can tell, as the story goes, that's clearly was not the bet to make. I think Elon and his team, you look at Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, they're incredible engineers, right? They're incredible engineers that know how to iterate and ship. But yes, I wish we were back there too, as well, saying yes to that investment.
Well, and since the Fiskers are friends, we'll give them a shout out. They've come back, in version 2 is working great.
They have the Ocean, looks like an incredible SUV. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question while we're on it? Because I think that what you're hitting on and what Mike was alluding to in his upfront is that, the public markets over the last, I guess, really starting in 2020, 2019, 2020, the public market started taking a lot of this, they started financing a lot of these transition stories, if you will, and started giving them good values. And as a private investor, right, that's the thing that's made the 1 billion worth 3, something like that. I mean, it's the thing that is pulling the engine along. How important is the public market to you as a private energy technology investor?
They're incredibly important. I mean, I don't think anyone could have expected when Beyond Meat went public, the reaction to that company. I don't think anyone could have predicted the reaction to Tesla and its market cap after they started shipping. But you are right. The past year and a half has not been a great one for public markets, specifically, for technology companies as a whole and a handful of other categories, right? There is this compression and drawback, I guess compression is the best way to say it. And I think you're seeing that in the private markets as well in the later stages. But, to directly answer your question, the public markets are key and critical. I think all the companies that we invest in, that is, the North Star. And so we try to grow them and operate them in a way that they can perform really well there.
As a venture capitalist, because I'm sort of, again, speaking for the community of folks we have watching, I think they're probably a little more familiar with the private equity world than the venture capital world. And everybody knows, private equity is thinking about the mark to market on their investments. In venture capital, are you, with the volatility of some of these things, do you stress around where these stock prices are and where they are at the end of the year? Or what's the psychology around those values?
Yeah, so we're early stage venture capitalists, right? This is the seed capital a company gets, or the Series A. And so we're talking about a company that's maybe, 8 people or 30 people, or just, 2 or 3 people with an idea. And so we've got a very long-term view of our relationship with the founders and the companies and growing them. But, as you start raising later and later rounds, the Series C, D, E, and nearing that public stage, of course, I think in every venture capital firm right now, the conversations are, what do these later stage valuations look like? What does it mean for us if we haven't raised yet, if you're a company, right? Or if you have raised, what does it mean for you when you have to go back out again? I think without a doubt, everybody has to perform and grow. And, Yeah. So no, everyone is thinking about that question.
And just a nuts and bolts question: once things go public, do you guys continue to hold them, or what's your philosophy once it goes public?
That's a great question. I think it really does depend on the firm, and it depends on, I think, the partners. There's a handful of venture capital firms that as soon as it's public, the early stage venture capitalists will roll off, and really have that board construct, have great operators and really public company board members. But there are also a handful where we stay on. John's been on the board of Alphabet since it went public. I think there's a lot of pride in being there with the founders. Really, they do all of the hard work and you're really there in their corner supporting them. And you do want to see them into, that next journey, right? Like the journey isn't over when you're public, right? For many of these companies, it's only the beginning. So you'll see both. You'll see a spectrum of things, people rolling off, people staying, and it's by choice.
It certainly comes up a lot in energy, and it comes up certainly as a function of COVID and just in the economy more broadly, is we're all talking about inflation. We're all talking about the way costs have gone up, and there's many different factors you might cite in that. One of the things that you guys do in the book, and it was, I think this was the third slide that we found, is that you talked about the green premium and sort of the current difference between doing it a certain way versus doing it the classic way. And again, you're hoping to bring down these premiums through your investing. But let's pull up that third slide, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this orientation that you guys brought to the book.
Of course. So the green premium is a concept that was introduced by Bill Gates, and really in his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And the green premium, like you said, is simply the cost difference between the clean green thing and its fossil fuel equivalent, right? There is a delta. And unfortunately, the reality is today, for many categories, there is a green premium. So it is more expensive to, pick the electric car versus the fossil fuel equivalent, or to buy sustainable air fuel versus just normal air fuel. And that green premium is the piece that's really the nut that you have to crack in the world of commodities, right? When that green premium hits zero and becomes negative, it's a green discount. And when that green discount happens, market forces can finally take over, right? There's a particular category where you can see that energy and that flow of capital happening. And it's particularly in solar and wind, right? Solar and wind, you've got to think just maybe in the past decade, has gotten very competitive with its, natural gas as well as coal projects in many parts of the world. And then really these past few years, almost everywhere in the world. And because of that, you actually see project financing happening that's just happening from normal banks. If you look at BNEF data, year over year for the past couple, you've seen $300 billion go out into these projects all around the world. But that green premium, so there's a green discount if you're just looking for solar and wind and dropping it on the grid. But there's still a green premium there if you want to take solar and wind and add storage to it. And so when you're thinking about a project just from the sheer cost of operations, it is still cheaper for that natural gas plant compared to solar, wind plus storage. But what you can see in the cost curves, though, is that it's going down year over year. And so while today that's true in the LCOE, I've got to imagine in the next year, 2 or 3, that actual intersection will happen. You actually can see in the max and mins, they're really close. And that's a really exciting moment.
So Ryan, the book, again, it's really laid out as a think piece on how we could do all this by 2050. And it goes through the buckets, but it's sort of, it's agnostic, if you will, about where exactly the money should go, or where the promise is greatest. You guys kind of stay away from that. But as you think about investing and that chart we had, are you drawn to things where the green premium is the smallest in the hopes that you could get it over the line, or are you alternatively drawn to something where you can make the most progress, or how do you think about that?
That's a great question. I think being, first, it's about being really transparent and honest about the green premium in making these investment decisions, in choosing to invest in a company, right? There has to be a pathway for that curve to drop down. right? Because if there's not, well, then you know that perhaps that isn't the right technology to bet on. If you look at the speed and scale plan, there's a set of KRs around innovation that are all about price, right? We set electricity targets for peak and base load. And depending on if you choose geothermal or use safer nuclear or fusion, all these new technologies that are coming out have to still at the end of the day compete on cost. And so it's always at the front of mind. It's always about how do you draw it down? Can, using Wright's law, does scale get you there? Or are there other innovations that need to happen on processes to get that cost down? And if not, well, that may not be a technology pathway to pursue.
It's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, Ryan. And one of the things that has kind of occurred to me, and I think we've learned here over the last 6-9 months, with essentially everything going up in price, raw materials going up in price across the board. And I think people realizing that, guess what, solar and wind and all these things that are going to basically take us to the green world are made with fossil fuels. And as fossil fuels go up, so does the price of these products. And so solar's been going down for 4, 5, 6 years in a row, and now it's going back up. And so I guess, one of the things that concerns me, one of the questions I have for you is, it seems like a lot of the transition goals that people are looking at require the raw materials to be there, the supply chains to be there, and it just doesn't seem like there's been enough work on that, to say, what, we're going to have those raw materials, those supply chains. And I think one of the things, we were at Sarah a couple of weeks back, and JB Straubel was at Redwood Materials. We're talking about, we're going to need recycling and all this other stuff. Mining companies were saying, hey, we need 8, 9, 10 years to bring this stuff on. And so I wonder if, you're concerned about getting to the 2030 goals, because guess what? The supply chains are just not going to be there. They're going to be a lot more difficult than we had have thought 2 years ago. How does that kind of factor in your thinking right now? And is this something we talked about earlier about the Defense Budget Act? I mean, of us trying to can we get there? Are those goals realistic with what's going on right now in global markets and, just supply chains and just getting the raw materials? How do you look at that?
It's an incredibly important observation, right? If you and I try to buy today, a Tesla or a, electric vehicle from any of the big manufacturers, we can't pick it up the same day or the same month. I think Tesla's running time is maybe a couple of months now, and for some of their products, almost to the end of the year. And if you expect us, right, we have a goal in the speed and scale plan that is, in 10 years, you've got 50% of vehicles being sold that are electric. We're not moving at the speed, right, or even scale of sales that we need to be. And it is a supply chain crunch crisis, but it's not just being felt by the EV manufacturers. It's also being felt by just the general car manufacturers as well. But the amount of, the mineral piece is an important one. I think it's about almost 70% of the minerals today used for batteries, for lithium ion batteries, still come from China, and we haven't created a domestic supply of it. Doesn't mean we can't, we just haven't put the effort and energy behind it. I think this order by the president last week is a really important one. It's really important for us to lock down and be energy secure. And I think the definition of energy security in the future is evolving, right? Not just to be oil and gas security, but what about, battery storage security, the ability to make PV and wind domestically, and just really about energy as like a broader category. And so I think the definition of energy security is evolving in real time. And it's a really exciting moment to be not only in business in, but really to be living through.
Yeah, and I would also point out that, half of your global reductions is coming from transportation and the grid. And what really, stood out to me is how big the grid is really part of the whole, reduction that needs to happen. And it feels like the public really doesn't really think about the grid as being an area that we need to really cut a lot of pollution. It's really cars, transportation, but that thing is the biggest piece. And obviously the raw materials and stuff that we need, copper and stuff of that nature, is going to be a big part of that. So that was a little concerning to me.
It's why we wrote the book for leaders, right? There's a lot of individual actions we can do, but to really move the needle on the gigatons, we have to change the energy that's going into our grids. We have to change and pass policies that help, people switch to electric vehicles faster, right? I think, anybody listening to this, it's like really how do you make the next car you purchase an electric vehicle, not another fossil fuel vehicle, especially if you can afford an expensive car these days, right? Another vehicle on the road means another 14 to 20 years of emitting. And so I think, the goals we put forth are really ambitious, but I think you're reminding the sheer physics that are involved in making this revolution and transition happen are humongous. This isn't a digital problem, it's an analog one, so in Silicon Valley, we're very used to amazing ability to scale digital things. I think right now, this analog opportunity is actually one where you're going to see a lot of wealth created, not from, Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, but all across the country and all across the world. And that's actually what's really exciting about this clean energy transition, is that the winners aren't in this zip code where I live in. They're actually going to be everywhere. And that's exciting.
So Ryan, you mentioned energy security, and one of the things that, the book came out in November. We worked on it for 2.5 years, and then it was around November that we were starting to talk about the energy crisis happening in Europe, and just kind of that energy system and some of the results it was creating, and then we layered on Ukraine, which is obviously a terrible situation. And then and of course, this whole thing is permeated by we're going to de-globalize the world. We're going to go back to more regional thinking for a lot of reasons. This is a really hard question. Yeah. How would you kind of update the book, if you will, for, here we are 4 months later and a ton of stuff has changed. What would be the key points of the addendum if you were writing it today?
We have an intention to update the book about every year. And in the book right now, we call Russia a rogue nation, a rogue actor. And they've been beyond rogue. They've been, catastrophic on a humanitarian sense. But on the energy security crisis, they really showed what happens when you're dependent on a single source, right, for the predominant use of your energy. And the way the world has reacted has been incredible, right? When you think about how, the European Union as well as the US, but really let's, talk about the EU for a sec, and their plans to reduce their dependency on Russian natural gas, Russian oil, and other sources, right? It's about, one, finding other sources around the world, leaning on allies to provide the oil and gas that they need on the short term. But then they've got these longer term actions that'll help them get ready for next winter, right? Deploying energy efficiency, getting more solar and wind on their grids, accelerating the switch to electric vehicles. I think there's one truth, you had Dan Jurgen on your show, and I love his book so much, The New Map. And, he really captures what energy fluctuation and cost can do to the world and the wars that it leads to. And I think there's one truism that will happen with, infinite energy sources, right? The clean energy ones versus the finite ones, is that you have more price predictability. And with predictability is really security and independence. And so I think what, an after effect or a current effect, because the war is still happening, is that you're going to see a lot of countries look to really ensuring that their domestic supply of energy comes from these renewable places, the places where they don't have to go to the markets or don't have to import it in from others. And I think that was very unexpected, but it is a very exciting outcome from it, because us as the US, I think, can be, the provider of these, let's call them freedom fuels, right? Like the solar technologies, the wind technologies, the battery technologies, and so forth. Those can come from American companies, and we can, really help. Just like in World War II, we built the Liberty ships and the tanks, and there's no reason we can't do the same here. Most of these technologies were invented here. A fun fact in Dan Jurgen's book that I learned, it's like in the 70s, Exxon invented the lithium ion battery. These are very amazing innovations that we created here, but unfortunately, during the clean tech 1.0 wave, we didn't invest in them as a country the way that China did. You look at the top 15 billionaires around the world, of course, Elon Musk is at the top, but the next 13 are solar and storage companies in China. they saw it as a strategic both jobs and energy opportunity to own that market. But guess what? It's the clean tech 2.0 wave, and there's no reason we can't be the winners and owners there.
Well, I think you're hitting, Mike, and you, Ryan, are both hitting on something which had been concerning us as we've been watching this energy transition, which is we were surrendering some energy security because we looked like we were moving increasingly towards depending on a lot of minerals and materials that we don't have or are not willing to mine. And now maybe, I think actually Secretary Granholm at CIRA just kind of admitted that the Chinese have locked up a lot of this stuff internationally. So we're going to have to get focused. And let me just switch gears for a minute, and then we want to get Colin in here to ask a couple of questions, which is in all of this, we talk a lot about Europe and the US and the OECD, and that's where a lot of that's where the technology and the money and the investing and a lot of that stuff is going on. But you had a great slide, it's page 6, that we pulled from the book that we always try to remind ourselves here. And the slide was, the game will be won or lost in the developing countries. And then you had one more thought that really complements it well, which is the 5th slide we pulled, where you say scale is the hardest thing to wrap your head around. I think sometimes we get a little frustrated, Ryan, honestly, because, and I don't know why I always think of Connecticut, but we're trying to make Connecticut safe for the energy transition, and we really need to be focused on China, India, scale, big impacts. Your book does a great job. It shows you all the ways in which you can make a difference, which I think the world thirsts for. But at the same time, we're also thirsting for how quickly can we solve it, and where are the big problems, and let's go there. So if we could spend a little time on that, that'd be great.
One of the a lot of very quick reactions to the book will sometimes be, well, doesn't China, have to go first, or India, right? They're emitting the most right now. And, in the book, we're really clear. We say that as the United States, we are the alpha emitter. We've emitted the most in history. And because of that, we should go first, right? There's no creating a line. And not just that, we, along with Europe and China, should be leading on this, right? The 3, big regions. And there's a reason to go first. One, we go first. It means that we get to show the world that it's possible. And in doing that, we get to drive down that green premium for the developing world, right? Where things are still more, expensive for them to make these choices. But I think very selfishly, as a venture capitalist, it also means that we get to own those industries. So if we go first, we get to lead. And that's why, we also remind that this is won or lost in the developing world, but we've got to work really hard here in the US, in Europe, and in China to drive down the green premium. Then we can go to other countries and say, hey, leapfrog, right? Don't make the same grid decisions that we did. Don't make the same energy decisions that we did. But there's no way that, John or I could look at a country in Africa and say, you can't pick that natural gas plant right now. Right? There are countries that have 40% energy security. And in that world, you have to pick the reliable thing and what works right now. But our reminder in the book is, but really think about your grid plan. You don't need to have your entire grid on natural gas. You can have it complemented with a really great infrastructure of solar and wind and other things. You can use distributed energy. Like, there's a really thoughtful way that you can pick the best right now. And so that's kind of the message we put hopefully really clear in the book.
Well, Colin, you got to jump in here next, but we're on something which is, I think is, we're all a bit of a victim of the world we grow up in, right? And so for those of us who grow up in energy, you have a mentality about finding costs, or your mentality is go to the problem where your dollar is going to go the furthest, quickest. And so when you look at the global climate problem and you think finding cost, you say, gosh, take me to the dirtiest coal plant in the world. I'm going to knock it out. and tell me, and I'm gonna do that over and over again. So that's kind of a finding cost mentality. Yours is a technology mentality, which is take me to the new way to do things. That's how I create value. That's how I've historically created value. So it just shows you, I think, because I feel like if an energy community wrote the book, the energy community would have a lot of the same things, but then it would orient towards, I'm going to go to the place, even if I use old technologies, I'm going to go to the place where I can knock out the most carbon first.
There's no community on the planet knows scale like the energy community. I want to make sure everyone that's listening to this, like, we are in awe of the materials, just every part of how the world works. I mean, you've got to think about the amount of energy security domestically we've been able to create because of natural gas and discoveries of oil. Like, it is incredible. You just look at the charts of the United States energy security over the past 15 years, right? And everybody listening to this is truly credit to the work that those teams have done for the past 2 decades. The story, though, for the future, though, is we're not just oil and gas companies anymore. We're energy companies, right? Exxon invented the lithium ion battery. In the book, we talk about Ørsted, right? The original natural gas giant in Denmark. And, they couldn't compete, though, with our shale boom here in the US. And they had to find new models for them to be an energy company. And for them, it was through offshore wind. And, when you look at an energy company that's been able to navigate a transition and use all of its expertise, what is it? In 5 years, they dropped the cost of offshore wind by some 60%. Their company is now, worth $50 billion. It's on the stock market. It's the leader. And so I think one message I would love everyone listening to take with them is that we're not defined by the technology that we're using today. We're really defined by delivering energy to our customers. And I think we've got to really figure out how we own the clean and green way of doing it. And, looking at an Ørsted is a really neat example because they were able to take a lot of their expertise and apply it in a slightly different way, but become a incredible energy company.
Ryan, I'm fascinated to hear your perspective as an early stage venture investor and also as an engineer about these breakthroughs that we've seen in nuclear fusion. Because of course, the joke is that nuclear fusion is the technology of the future and always will be. And yet disruption is what you do for a living, right? So as you, as an investor, look at the opportunity for small modular nuclear or next generation fission, or the moonshot, as you call it in the book, in fusion, where are we? And has your optimism either gone up or down?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the book, we are, I always refer to the book, but it really is the plan. The plan is agnostic to the, zero emission energy source. And so we're huge fans of nuclear. That's also one reaction from the crisis happening in Russia and Ukraine, is that there's a handful of nuclear power plants that were likely scheduled to be decommissioned. They're going to be extending those lifespans of them. We're really fans of what they call Gen 4 nuclear, right? Gen 3 is the current ones that are out there, but Gen 4 are the newer, safer ways. But, in the US, we haven't approved a new nuclear project in forever. You go to a country like France, it's very cookie cutter. They know how to approve those things. And, the leaps in safety in these new approaches are worth trying. But it also is still very expensive, but they're worth trying. You asked about fusion. So fission energy is the nuclear power plants that we know. There's a whole new way of generating energy called fusion that's worth looking into. There's a portfolio company of ours called Commonwealth Fusion that hit a pretty record milestone. We've stayed away from fusion for quite some time because we felt there was always too much technical risk, as the engineers and us. And just a year ago, that team hit an incredible milestone in the magnet that they were able to create. They created a magnet in a form factor that, if it could prove powerful, you could scale it up. And they hit the 20 Tesla mark. And so I think folks saw the funding announcement maybe a few months back around Commonwealth Fusion, the $1 billion that are going towards it. And the exciting piece there is just using, isotopes of hydrogen and basically water. You can create a really resilient form of power. But Colin, that technology is not going to be ready this decade. And so I think, we're balancing two things. We need both we both need the now and the new. And so the now are, what technologies do we have that can get us to cut our emissions in half by the end of this decade? And then what are the other things we can invest in, like advanced nuclear and fusion and fission and all the, carbon removal technologies that help us get to zero in those next 20 years?
I think one of the things while I'm thinking about it, Ryan, that you guys should talk a lot about in the book is just, the usefulness of more R&D and increasing R&D. And that's an obvious, this fusion conversation makes me think of it, but I think that's something that we can all agree on, is more basic science around all these things would be such a good thing. Can I ask you a question though, just out of curiosity? So when you think about as an investor and investing in fusion or in some of these other things, it's massive capital spend, it's hard technology, and I'm not a fusion expert, but I'm just saying when it comes to hard tech, it's a lot of capital and long development periods. Do you organize your funds by, who would like to invest in energy venture capital, and we have a separate fund for that, for people with that risk? Or do you kind of pool it all together for broad-based technology venture capital investing?
It's a great. So for us at Kleiner, we have a main fund that will do a portion of climate investing, like the company Watershed, which helps with carbon accounting. But there are specialized funds that we're involved with, everything from G2 Venture Partners to Breakthrough Energy Ventures or Earthshot or the lower carbon capital folks. They're going all in 100% on this transition, right? What investments need to be made there. And the neat thing about that kind of structure is that you can then hire and create a team that not only has the operational chops that need to meet the scale part of the puzzle, but they also have the technical chops to be able to assess these ideas and see how they can come down, the cost curve and to, beat those green premiums. But we also coach the companies, the way when I heard you ask that question, I thought it was going to be around, when companies are fundraising themselves, how are things different? And the reality is, because you're dealing with the analog and not the digital stuff, you have to raise a lot more than a traditional tech company. And what you will actually see is that there's a lot of, at least the pattern that seems to be working well is that, find a handful of well-capitalized investors, not just venture capitalists, but what companies are there that want to lead on this transition, right? In the example of QuantumScape, Volkswagen taking a humongous leadership position as an investor in the company. Like, these are really neat ways for the new to pair up with the foundational, right? These large companies that understand scale, that need to build out the future, and you can see these kind of things combine.
So that sounds like, Ryan, and I'm just thinking hypothetically, but if a big classic energy company, you would find them an attractive co-investor because they would bring scale and knowledge and all the skills yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a handful of categories that it fits so naturally for many of them, right? There's a handful of things in the carbon removal space. There's a handful of things in the geothermal space. Think any of these new energy technologies, like these are all incredible fits. And if anything, I think those investors could bring a lot of just experience to the table, like running companies of that scale that require the amount of just movement of energy. I think the more that you see, founders and just really hungry engineers come from traditional energy into new energy, I think the more successful we're going to be as a whole.
I think that's part of what you're seeing in real time right now. Part of the reason the prices have to move so much is because that scale is not instantaneously available. So you see, policymakers and others say, well, how come you're just increase production or just get it over to Europe or just make it happen. And the engineers want to throw their hands in the air because they're like, do you understand the numbers we are talking about? They're huge. And that reliability component, even if you could do it for one day or 1 week, do it over and over and over and over again, is very logistically challenging.
It is it's insane how challenging it is. You know, there's like a funny set of tweets on, or not funny, but just interesting set of tweets online of, you know, Elon Musk tweeting at the Rivian CEO. I think the Rivian CEO was opening up another factory, and he's like, wait, don't do that. You know, one competitor CEO to another. He's like, get it right well in one factory before jumping to the next. And, you know, I think the neat thing here is this transition is going to be so monumental that I think a lot of the players, at least in the clean tech arena, don't see each other yet as like competitors where you have to like not be collegial about it. And so there's something really fun about this moment where all the carbon removal companies, they get together, they, you know, iterate on things together. And I think the same is happening too with the electrification of vehicles as well. You can see each of them really trying to help each other out in kind of a fun collegial way, but still competitive. It's still competitive, but yeah.
Well, look, Ryan, we're going to lose you. We knew we would have great fun with you. And so I've only got, you know, another 9 questions teed up, and I don't know how we're going to squeeze them into the box. We are going to ask you our favorite one, which is, you know, what does this whole thing look like? Energy, technology, the environment. What does this look like in 10 years? But you know that one's coming. I guess there's an interesting, we had so much fun with the book. If we can show you slide 7, which is interesting because you talked about the climate crisis is one of the biggest innovation opportunities.
Yes.
And so so in a certain sense, we've entered a period of great optimism, great technical challenge, purpose. You know, this is going to be a fascinating and exciting time. But there's a second quote in the book, and this is the way the climate situation is so unique, and it's on page 8, where the book says, if this book scares you into action, if it makes you as fearful as I am, I think this is John's voice, then I have done my job. But for our fear to work for us, it needs to galvanize, not paralyze. And I think what we're always struck by is it's you know, innovation seems, it mates best with optimism, trying to innovate out of fear, that, you know, trying to get, I think this is, and I'm kind of speaking for the team a little bit here, so I don't mean to, because we've all got different views, but it seems like where we are now is there are some people who think climate is the #1 problem on the planet. And there are others who have it as a 7, and then there are people who have it as a 12, and, you know, et cetera. And so what we're really disagreeing about is prioritization and holistic solutions versus, you know, singular ones. How do we get the balance of optimism and fear right in this thing so that we, you know, have the right amount of perspective?
You know, John and I are engineers, and you know, the IPCC, this is the UN group that comes together every 5-ish years to put together the report that says, how bad is it, why, and what are the solutions? And, you know, things are getting worse because the world is getting warmer, right? There's this target of 1.5 degrees that we're trying to keep warming to. And, you know, with that warming will come effects. And the point is for it not to get to 2 degrees or 3 degrees or anything beyond. And in these reports, they said, well, if we can keep the emissions to 400 gigatons, then, well, we'll keep warming with, you know, a certain probability to that 1.5. And so we look at that 400 gigatons and say, well, yeah, as engineers, we can figure out how to work a plan. And our hope here is there's a lot of just stuff that is coming out that just really scares you and may not make you take action. And we hope Speed and Scale, and, you know, the website we have, speedandscale.com, shows you that we can get halfway there by the end of this decade, and we can get to zero by 2050, but we've got to work incredibly hard about it. Here are the key results and measures that matter. And we really hope it does that galvanizing. You know, this climate crisis isn't as hard as it looks to solve it. But that's thanks to, the past 30 plus years of innovation. And we're going to need another 30 years of innovation, but we've got to get to work now.
Well, you mentioned Dan Jurgen. I think as you answer the 10-year question, one of the things Dan said is usually some sort of innovation shows up in energy that we've been working on for a long time, and it comes and it surprises you. What would be in the next 10 years, just a little bit of crystal ball, what could surprise us? How are you thinking about how it looks out there?
Ooh, crystal ball. I think out of left field, if there's something in long duration storage that appears that really reduces the cost of it, right? Lithium ion is just doing incredible things on that cost curve, being kind of the choice technology. But if one of these long duration storage options really work, that changes everything. If you create the world's biggest battery in different parts of the country, you can start to really take advantage of wind in the places that it blows really well, and solar in the places that are sunny, and use it in this incredibly exciting way. But that's one of those things that in the crystal ball, I think could change everything. Because right now, most of the energy is really being delivered on demand. And as soon as you can start to store it at scale, you can actually do some really neat things.
Well, you've been very generous with your time. We're so delighted to have you. We're going to end with a slide that is from the book. It was the 9th slide we found, and it really captures what we're doing here, Ryan. While none of us have all the answers together, we may find a solution. I think so we're in Houston. We, know and love energy and are so excited about everything that could happen here. But the bridge between the tech community and all the engineering and science and capabilities that live there, and you've hit on it already, and the scale and knowledge and experience and reliability that comes out of the classic energy community, we're really positive about that. And you being with us and spending all this time and writing the book, it's just a great step in fulfilling the promise of that last slide we showed.
Thank you. I think it goes to the question that you're saying that you wanted to end with, which is the what happens between now and 2030, and what does the world look like? I am an incredible optimist, and I think if we can show it to ourselves that we can cut emissions in half using the technologies that we've invented already, but they're still not at the scale they need to be, right? Like that's the challenge of the moment. Can we scale up the electric vehicles that we need, the clean energy sources on the grid, us eating less beef, right? Those 3 things can get us to that halfway mark by the end of this decade. And then think about the optimism and momentum that we'll have as we run through the next 2 decades. And think about if all the, companies that are creating those alternatives are, based here. And by the way, the here I'm saying is wherever anyone who's listening to this, right? I know your audience isn't just from the US, right? This is perhaps the only time in the past 60, 70 years where we're living through an active energy transition that's going to happen faster than we think. And so the question is, do you get ahead of that wave and ride it? Or do you get left behind? And I think already from the conversation that we're having, I think this group here cares about riding that wave. And so thank you so much for allowing me to share Speed and Scale with your audience. And, I'm here, and John and I are both here for anybody really, if they have questions or these collective ideas. We're both John and Ryan at speedandscale.com. And we'd love to hear from you.
Well, and when you're in Houston, please come by and see us. Colin, how many countries are we going to now? You had this stat just the other day.
We just crossed 70.
Wow.
Just crossed 70. All right.
This energy thing, it's addicting.
Intensity of use is not uniform across the planet, though. I will concede.
And and I feel like crying. I didn't get a chance to do a commercial for natural gas, particularly U.S. natural gas, but we'll do that on the next show, Ryan.
That the industry there, there's an opportunity to on the leak side, on the carbon capture side, to really be that fuel that does carry us as this transition happens, right? There's no reason why a coal plant should be operating anymore, right? Like there's, I mean, here, you had that one picture that's there, but tech transitions happen, in our industry, we see them every 5 years. And I think together, us as the energy industry, we get to kind of steer and navigate this one together. So thank you for the time.
Yeah, you're making me realize we need a 25-year partnership against coal, and then we'll figure it out what happens on the other side of that. Now I feel bad. The coal guys feel like I'm picking on them. We're all part of this. We're going to figure it out. Thank you, Ryan. We appreciate you, sir.